Welcome everybody to LACOL 2021, hosted by Hamilton College. I'm so thrilled to see so many of you pinging in here with us in the virtual space. And I'd like, before I go any further, to give my thanks to Liz Evans, the director of LACOL, and to our own Hamilton College Steering Committee for their incredible work in organizing this three-day workshop. My pleasant task today is to introduce our keynote speaker. Please note that after the talk, there will be a Q&A moderated by my colleague, Ara Wu, Data Science and Analysis Research Librarian at Hamilton College. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Catherine D'Ignazio. Dr. D'Ignazio is a scholar, artist, designer, and hacker mama who focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement. She has run reproductive justice hackathons, designed global news recommendation systems, created talking and tweeting water quality sculptures, and led a walking data visualization to envision the future of sea level rise. With Rahul Bhargava, she built the platform DataBasic.io, a suite of tools and activities to introduce newcomers to data science. Her 2020 book from MIT Press, Data Feminism, co-authored with Lauren Klein, charts a course for more ethical and empowering data science practices. And I gather that's one of the books that has been being raffled. I think there's information about that in the Slack channel. In addition, her research at the intersection of technology, design, and social justice has been published in the Journal of Peer Production, the Journal of Community Informatics, and the Proceedings of Human Factors in Computing Systems. Moreover, her art and design projects have won awards from the TON Foundation, Turbulence.org, and the Knight Foundation, and exhibited at the Venice Biennial and the ICA Boston. Dr. D'Ignazio is an assistant professor of urban science and planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. She is also director of the Data Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity, particularly in relation to space and place. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine D'Ignazio, who will be speaking to us today on data feminism.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for those emojis. For the people that I can't see everybody, but the people that are doing this, thank you. Thank you, Suzanne, for the warm introduction. And thank you to Nora and Liz for the invitation to be here with you all. It's a real honor. So let me get started. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. I can see the people. Okay. So this is where we're headed today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Lauren Klein and I's recent book called Data Feminism that Suzanne referenced. And give you a little bit about our motivations for writing the book, tell you a little bit about the feminism, what the feminism part of this title means, which sort of type of feminism are we really pulling from and drawing from in the book, and then show you some of the examples that come out of the book, which I think relate a lot to the themes of your conference this year. So one important thing to say is that the book is co-authored by myself and Lauren Klein. If you don't know her, I encourage you to check out her work. It's really amazing. She does a lot in digital humanities specifically. She's actually the director of a lab called the Digital Humanities Lab at Emory University. And you can follow her work with the handle there. And then I think the only last important thing to say on this slide is that Data Feminism is open access as well, so you can buy it. It's a physical book, and it has some really beautiful images in it. But you can also just read it for free online, thanks to the MIT libraries and MIT Press providing open access. And so to do that, you go to the datafeminism.io, which is our book's website, and there's a big button that says read the book, and just click on that, and that'll take you to the site. So get started. So Lauren and I see data feminism as really part of a growing body of work that's working to hold corporate and government actors accountable for essentially making racist, sexist, classist data products. So I don't know how much folks in this audience follow these conversations in this space, but almost every week there's some new popular press account of discriminatory algorithms, technologies, and so on. And so these are things like face detection systems that cannot see, quote unquote, women of color. There are things like hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, child abuse detection algorithms that punish poor parents, data visualizations that reinforce the gender binary, and so on. And in a sense, what motivated us to write the book is that these examples just keep coming, like they just keep surfacing, and the popular press keeps covering them with this kind of expression of shock and surprise, like sort of the throwing up of the hands and being like, oh my God, the algorithm is sexist, or oh my God, the algorithm is racist, and so on. And, we want to kind of like break this down. I say, in fact, this should be like not surprising at all that this is what is happening. So how do we sort of back up, get out of that place of surprise, and actually start to do something about this? And in a large way, what we see the book sort of pushing back against is this growing conversation that is challenging the meme, and we would characterize this as a meme that you see at the top of your screen here. So this data is the new oil. I don't know how many folks have heard this. It's kind of old at this point. This is a meme that kind of started in the mid 2000s. It got real boosted by the Economist magazine in the early 2010s. And it has since circulated. It's circulated so much that there's actually mashup videos on YouTube of like a million different people saying this in different places and so on. And it's a really interesting metaphor if you think about it. So usually when people are saying this, they mean it in a good way, like a positive way. And it is really interesting to think about the actions and verbs that we use with data and how similar they are to those that we use with oil. So, raw data, raw oil, we process both, we clean both, we refine both, and so on and so forth. These are sort of like metaphors of extraction. And there's been a growing pushback to this, because just as with oil, the effects of data, like these great benefits that they're touting, which are really essentially about profit, are definitely not equally distributed. And in fact, there's been a growing pushback from many people along the lines of data is the same old oppression. And this is being led, in many cases by Black and Indigenous women of color, by white women, by Indigenous people, immigrant communities, LGBTQ folks, and more, because they're experiencing data as this kind of the same process of data extraction is really just the same old oppression. And the danger here is that, this sort of era of big data, instead of, redistributing benefits to all members of society, what it's actually doing is working to accelerate and exacerbate existing social inequalities and divisions. And we're not the first ones to have said this in any way. And in fact, like the books and works that are at the bottom of this slide are some of the work that was inspirational to us as we were writing Data Feminism. And even what was heartening was like, even just in the couple of years we were writing Data Feminism, so much more work has come out that is critical, that is characterizing this pushback, that is coming up with ways that we can challenge this and so on. But so what our contribution is, though, is we explain in the book how feminism, and specifically intersectional feminism, has a lot to offer this conversation, because that it's been focused on dismantling instances of oppression for a very, very long time. But so it's important to point out that speaking out against this same old oppression carries consequences. So again, I'm not sure terms of like who's in the audience and what your backgrounds are, if you've heard of the case of Dr. Timnit Gebru. So until recently, she was the co-lead of ethical artificial intelligence at Google. She's really well known for her scholarship in machine vision, and also for her work on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in AI, which is a field that desperately needs diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she's also co-founder of Black in AI, which is a community for Black researchers in artificial intelligence. To make a very long story short, she and her team at Google had worked on this research paper for months. They submitted it to a conference, it was accepted, and then Google basically asked them to retract the paper. And the paper in question was about the dangers and risks of these large language processing models. And so when Dr. Gebru asked for transparency, along with answers about other DEI issues internally that she had been working on, the Google promptly fired her. And so the response to this, I think, was much more than Google expected. And it's a case that continues to circulate, that has provoked outrage, I think, in specifically in the technical community. So 2,500 Google employees signed a petition. 4,000 academics and AI researchers also signed that same petition. Then it's linked here. And they're basically demanding answers and transparency, which Google had not been transparent about publicly. And some HBCU recruiting firms dropped Google as a client. 9 members of Congress actually wrote a letter about this case demanding accountability or at least answers, but Google has not responded. So this treatment of Dr. Gebru is shameful, yet 2 of my colleagues and I, Dr. Turner and Dr. Wood at MIT, we point out in a new piece that this is not an isolated case. So in fact, the way that Dr. Gebru is treated is a centuries-old playbook that is used against Black women who speak truth to power. And so you can check out this piece called The Abuse and Misogynoir Playbook. So why does her case matter for AI, for the field of computer science, for data, everything more broadly? And how does this relate to our book? So feminism as both theory and practice demands that we ask who questions. And so these are questions that are sometimes uncomfortable because they're not considered sort of like in the sphere of what the intellectual field is normally about. They're questions like, data science by whom? Who is doing this work? And conversely, who is not present on the teams doing the work? Data science for whom? Who's benefiting from the work? Who's harmed by the work? Data sets about whom? Data science with whose values? And so the question remains, why are these feminist questions? And I don't know you all, so like maybe you are just so clear on feminism, but we always like to spend a little bit of time going over like the Feminism 101, just to be really precise about which feminism we are drawing from in our book. So what you see here is an image from the 2014 MTV Music Awards. And so this is when Beyonce projects the word feminist behind her, and she actually sings about feminism in the song Flawless, and is quoting the dictionary definition of the term, which is this: the feminist is the person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. So what we get from this definition is that feminism is a belief, and it's a belief in equality for all genders. So if you believe in equality for all genders, all you have to do is look around you and see that the world where all genders are equal has not yet been realized. And so there's a second definition that sort of follows from that, which is that feminism implies political action to realize that world. So it's organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. So it's a belief, it's political action. And then there's a third definition, which is that feminism is a set of theories and ideas. And I love this part because this is like feminism is an intellectual heritage. It is this set of theories that we inherit, that we can do something with, that we can take and we can use and apply to present day problems. So we don't have to invent things ourselves, right? Like we don't have to like invent it all. We don't have to solve all the problems alone. We have people to draw from that came before us. So these theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender, but really the past 40 years of scholarship and also our current political reality have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, and many more things. So this brings us back to really the central idea, the central feminism we're mobilizing in the book is intersectional feminism. And as you all may know, intersectionality is a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s. And she uses this term to explain, she's writing about Black women's experiences. And she uses this term to explain how social inequality cannot be explained by only one dimension of difference, such as gender. So when we talk about inequality or oppression, we have to talk about the intersection of the many forces and factors that produce it. So things like racism, classism, colonialism, and so on are all going to inflect our experiences of gender and of the world. So the key thing to understand about intersectionality, and it's sometimes overlooked in casual invocations of the term, is that it doesn't just describe individual markers of identity like I am white, I am cisgender, etc. It also is describing the structural forces of power, sexism, racism, the isms, basically, and their intersection that creates those effects. So it's really the work, it's important to say that this is the work of women of color feminists, Black feminists in particular, that have really foregrounded this conversation about forces of power. Because once we, once we take intersectionality seriously, what this calls on us to do is say, actually, feminism is not only about women. It's not even only about gender. It's really about power. It's about who has power and who does not have power. And so in today's world, data is power. And you can see that in just a real material way, in the sense of looking at like who are the companies that are making the most money right now. They are the companies that have the resources to collect, store, maintain, analyze, create products from, deploy, et cetera, large amounts of data. And so intersectional feminism, so the central argument of our book is that intersectional feminism, when it's applied to data science, can help that power be challenged and changed. So in a sense, we are arguing that data science really needs feminism, and it needs intersectional feminism in particular, if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances or challenge the status quo, which has not permitted the flourishing of a world in which all genders are equal. So that's where we are with the feminism. Hopefully that's not too 101. Again, like, as you know, sometimes I'm a little nervous about, you all may know this, all of this already, but we like to set the stage. So in writing the book, Lauren and I looked across a wide variety of feminist literature. And the sort of wonderful thing about feminist work is you can find it everywhere. It might feel niche, but then when you aggregate it, you're like, wow, there's a lot of this. And so we looked across many fields of both feminist scholarship and also feminist activism. And we were particularly looking for where people had sort of tried to apply feminist theory, either kind of taking feminist theoretical ideas and putting them into action in activist work, or else putting them into action into design work or in building technology work, in architecture work, kind of when we looked especially at kind of this intersection of feminism and making, or feminism and design. And from that, we came up with these 7 principles that these for us encapsulate the most important aspects of feminism as they relate to data science. And so there's 7 principles. And in fact, this is also how the book is structured. So each of these principles is a chapter in the book. The other thing, as we were writing the book, we really wanted this book to be accessible to both folks who had a background in data science but knew nothing about feminism, or folks who had a background in feminism but knew nothing about data science, or folks who knew nothing about either. And so what we tried to do is introduce, like, so for each chapter, we tried to introduce some of the feminist thinkers and activists and people who have come before us who have come up with these ideas, to introduce the reader to their work. And then also introduce the reader to some of the folks who are working with data today in the world that actually embody these principles. We use a lot of examples and a lot of sort of short stories in the book to try to demonstrate data feminism in action. And so the goal here was to really operationalize feminism for data science. So think about how can we provide models that might guide the work of people working with data or who want to work with data, or also people who want to refuse to work with data. There's an important sort of strand of refusal happening right now, particularly with surveillance technologies that are disproportionately targeting people of color, poor people, and so on. And so maybe the one, I won't have time to go over all the principles today, but maybe one important thing to note, you'll see that principle 1 and principle 2 are both about power, examine power and challenge power. And this is because, the heart of the feminist project, and in particular the intersectional feminist project, is this analysis of power. And that's really what feminism in a way brings to the table into data science and into technical fields, is an analysis of power that's sort of sorely missing, as I would say. And not, there are other kinds of analyses of power that we can do, but in general, mainstream data science is not typically asking questions about power and inequality. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples that come out of the book that show some of these principles in action. So we talk about projects like Mimi Onuoha's Library of Missing Data Sets. So this is from the first chapter, which is about examining power. And this idea of missing data sets, this is a term that Onuoha coined. And this describes data sets that a sort of reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need. But for various reasons, they don't actually exist in real life. So they're things like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or people excluded from public housing because of criminal records, or gender and race breakdown of the number of people who've gotten vaccinated in the United States. These are things that we don't know because we don't collect information about them, or the information we collect is partial and flawed. So Onuoha exhibits this library of missing data sets in this as an art piece. She's an artist, and it looks like this. It's this white cabinet with old school sort of file folders, and you can page through them. And the top of each file folder is labeled with the topic of the missing data set. And you can actually go up to it, you can take out the folder and you can open it up. But of course, when you open it, it's empty because we have no records about this particular topic. And Onuoha writes really eloquently about the reason why they're empty. And they're empty because of this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world. So who has this power? Data costs money, like data are expensive. Governments have this power, moneyed institutions, corporations have this power. Typically minoritized groups do not, which leads to these sort of data gaps. And so one important thing that this project points out, and that we talk a lot about in the book, is that there's a lot of conversation happening right now around biased data sets and biased algorithms, and all that work is very important. But we kind of try to point out that the bias is introduced into the system long before we even have a data set, right? It's in the decisions around what we choose to count and measure and collect and maintain and store information about, and what we conversely do not. And so we talk a lot in the book about missing data, the data that we do not collect, which often and disproportionately has to do with women's lives, bodies, health, gender minorities' lives, bodies, health, and so on. So this next example comes out of the second chapter, and it's about challenging power. So feminicide, this is about the topic of feminicide in Mexico. So for those of you who don't know, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include cis and trans women. Feminicides are legally defined as crimes in actually 18 countries in Latin America, including Mexico. However, even though the feminicide has been criminalized, the state does not systematically collect data about the issue. So they, in fact, don't know the scope and scale of the problem, nor have they trained their staff, like medical examiners, law enforcement, and so on, to be able to accurately classify a death as a feminicide. So this neglect on the part of the state is the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. And you can check out the hashtag Ni Una Menos to look into that further. Because specifically of the way in which the state neglects to fully implement its own laws and provisions. So we talk about the story of Maria Salguero. So she was frustrated by the lack of action on the part of the state, and she ended up setting out to collect the missing data herself. And in fact, she's been doing that for 6 years. So what she does is she spends 2 to 4 hours a day logging these deaths on a Google map and in a spreadsheet that she calls from reading news media reports about women's deaths. She's helped families locate loved ones with her data. She's provided it to journalists and NGOs. She has been called several times to testify in front of Mexico's Congress. And so she actually has, because she's been doing this work now for comparatively kind of long time, she has compiled the largest public archive of feminicides in Mexico. And so in the book, we talk about this as a kind of what we call feminist counter data. So this is a kind of activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. So this idea of collecting counter data represents one way, and it's important to say it's only one way, to use data to challenge power. And there's a big caveat here, which we talk about in the book as well, that, we say a lot that data are a double-edged sword, meaning like for any given social issue, the answer is not necessarily go collect more data, right? Because by collecting data, we have to come back to those who questions, thinking about who has information about whom, and what are they going to do with it, and how long are they going to keep it? Because then what can happen with collecting data, particularly about vulnerable or marginalized groups, is that we can then be making them visible to institutions or groups that may want to target them and harm them. And so, yeah, just one more quick note about this. Lest you think that missing data can't be visualized, here's a still from a piece called Bruises, The Data We Don't See. This is by Georgia Lupi and Kaki King. And so this is another kind of missing data, actually. So this is data that documents qualitative experience and subjective perception. And so in this case, these are data that depict the case of a single mother, who's one of the authors of the work, taking care of her child as she dealt with a serious health illness, which involved bruises on the child's body. And so she had to keep these like extremely detailed records of like, where were the bruises, what was their color, and so on and so forth. So Lupi and King had to think really hard about how to constitute these data, to give them a visual form, but then the end result is an image that testifies to all of the emotion and labor and work that otherwise might not be recorded as data. So here, this relates to another principle from the book, which is about the importance of making labor visible. And we can talk more about that later, but this is just to make the point that just because data is missing doesn't mean it cannot be visualized. Okay, one quick question. How am I doing for time? Because that will affect what I show next.
You're doing fine for time. You got about another, I would say, 15 minutes.
15. Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's really good to know. Okay, so I'm going to go to, let's see, this slide. So Another principle from the book, and actually, I may end up talking about most of the principles, but another principle from the book is around process, and it's specifically around thinking about how do we create more participatory process for data science. There's a number of fields, like in design fields, participatory design is a very kind of established realm where there's many strategies for involving audiences and end users as makers and co-design partners. Similarly, in urban planning, there's strategies for citizen engagement. What do strategies look like for participation in the data science process? And so we talk a lot about pluralism in process and sort of who gets to participate in the chapter that's about pluralism. And feminist design is pretty specific about how we go about this, because if we're doing a participatory process, we can't kind of have everyone show up. Like, I don't know, if you're designing something that might be used by, say, 500 people, you can't get them all to be your partner, right? So how do we prioritize who is at the table as we are in a design process? So following the work of Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, and Shawan Barzell, a feminist design perspective takes power into account and centers the experiences of people at the edges and the margins first and foremost. And so thinks about how do we design for the margins first, and that will be a design that then also works for the center. And so this is very in line with the Design Justice Network, if folks have heard of them. There's a great book by Sasha Costanza-Chock called Design Justice. And they say, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. So the same should be true for the design of data science projects. So these are the folks who we should be working hard to build relationships with, working with to bring to the table to engage in participatory process. So the previous examples focus on the issue of power and people, but another major idea that comes from feminism relates to more conceptual structures of power and more specifically binary structures. So binary structures are, defined by this hard distinction between two groups of things. And the obvious reference point for feminist theorists here is the distinction between the idea of man and the idea of women. And so there's a lot of great feminist work that's about, deconstructing the gender binary for two reasons. And so the first reason is that the gender binary is not a binary, right? So like where there's this common sense notion that there are two genders, men and women, but in fact, empirically speaking, that's false. So we have an example here of a false binary first. And then secondly, that false binary also is presenting to us an unequal hierarchy, since in fact it's not men and women, it's men here and women here. So men are on top. And so the sort of move of feminist theorists has been to say, well, let's look out for binaries, because when we encounter a binary, it's probably hiding a lot of other categories that should be in the mix. And it's also probably creating a hierarchy and sort of saying one thing is better over another thing. And so some other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world are things like the distinction between nature and culture, subject and object, or the one that this next example takes up is the artificial distinction between reason and emotion. So in the Anglo-Western context, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in data, and specifically in data visualization. And so, best practices for data visualization, at least over the past 20 or 25 years, have evolved to include things like a very clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, a kind of just the facts, neutral presentation. But in chapter 3, where we're talking about elevating emotion and embodiment, we question, why are these our best practices? Especially when research has shown that we interpret these aesthetic choices, like the aesthetic choice to be minimalist and neutral, we interpret that emotionally as well. Like there's an emotional dimension to neutrality. And then in fact, researchers have shown we tend to trust those types of charts more than we maybe should. There's a great paper out from Crystal Lee, which has shown how there's a lot of COVID data visualization spread by sort of anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers online that were using this sort of neutral scientificity, sort of objective visualizations to present really ideological and questionable information. So what about the opposite? So what about visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion? And that's what this example helps us explore. So this is an example from US, it's a design firm named Periscopic created this. And they've been doing this since 2013, and they've done different versions for different years. It's actually a screenshot of an animation. So when you load the page, you will see these arcs, these orange and gray arcs animated. And each of these arcs represents the life of one person killed by gun violence in the United States. They start out really slowly, and then they get faster and faster and faster until they're sort of just proliferating on the screen, but then it still takes a really long time for the visualization to sort of finish counting the individual people. And here this counter sort of goes up as it is doing its animation. And then there's this really interesting sort of more speculative statistic here, which is around stolen years. And so what they did to design the visualization is that this part here where it's orange, this is the part where the person was alive, and then their life is cut short by gun violence, but the team projected how long would they have lived. They used a statistical model to say how long would this person have lived if their life had not been cut short. And then they project them out as a gray sort of finishing to the arc over here. And then they compute in aggregate the number of years that were stolen from all of the people. And it's, 500,000 stolen years. So methodologically, it's very statistically sound. They're very transparent about their methods. But when this first came out, it was viewed with a lot of suspicion by the data visualization community, precisely because it made us feel. This is not neutral. This is framed around the emotion of loss, right? But a feminist approach here would say this is not a problem at all, that it made us feel things. In fact, it's more a compelling visualization because it blends reason and emotion. One could even argue that it's a more ethical visualization because, instead of representing sort of human lives as ticks on a bar chart, sort of anonymously kind of collapsed into each other, there's a way in which we're framing this more around what is the collective reverberation of the loss of these lives, right? So rebalancing emotion and reason opens up our data communication toolbox and allows us to focus on what truly matters in a design process, which is honoring context, listening to experience, and taking action to challenge these issues that we encounter in the world. And then I just want to show a couple other examples of this because I just felt like the examples that come out of our chapter 3 relate a lot to your all's theme around play and innovation. So just to show a couple of other examples that might be inspirational here. So we can take this principle of elevating emotion even further and think about not only about how we visualize data, but how we communicate the significance of our data through other sensory forms beyond just visual, beyond just making sort of things for the eyes, right? So this is actually a project of Lauren's, which I love, where she's trying to work on doing embodied data communication. And she's talking about the educator from the 19th century who's named Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. And she was looking around at the dawn of the Civil War and recognized that her generation had done a really lousy job of figuring out how to address issues like slavery or the Civil War, this like kind of this rift that was threatening to tear the nation apart. And so she seized on visualization, large scale visualization, as a strategy as a pedagogical strategy. So what you see in the back left here is a visualization of all of the significant events of the 17th century. So it's like this abstraction where the events are placed on a timeline. And it was meant to be placed on a floor, like a rug, and then she would have her students sit around it. And it was abstract because she wanted each student to come up with their own narrative about how the events fit together. And so what Lauren has done with her team is this project from her digital humanities lab, where they tried to take that large scale floor chart and sort of recreate it with a touch interface so you can interact with the data with your whole body. So kind of like a recreation of this kind of incredible, very unknown data visualization from the 19th century. Or here's a project that takes this idea of embodied communication to a whole other level. So this is actually a project by the group Data Zetu in Tanzania. And so they ran this design competition for creating fabrics which embody statistics about gender-based violence. And so they embedded those statistics in the patterns. This is the winning pattern. This is the winning design. And so they held a fashion show with the winners. And so this, it's a lovely project to read about. This is like deeply participatory, involved dozens of designers, a number of different public events, and sort of very creative ways of presenting the data. But so here we have an example of embracing the whole human body as well as the social context, sort of all embodied in this act of data communication. And then the final example I wanted to just mention is that, one of the other strategies, in addition to collecting counter data that we talk about in the chapter about challenging power, we also talk about challenging power through teaching and really thinking carefully about how we teach data science and how we teach, especially newcomers, about the field and what its purpose is. And so in the book, we have a kind of critique of the typical way that data science, statistics, computer science, et cetera, usually taught. We call it a man factory because what happens is usually elite men, usually white men, are at the front of the classroom. Data science is usually framed as a very abstract and technical pursuit. It's framed as something that's very separate from the social context. The social political context is excluded from the methods. You're meant to use them in abstraction only. And then the goal of learning data science in sort of traditional, conventional work is usually modeled as you would learn this by sort of achieving individual mastery of technical concepts and skills. Whereas a kind of antidote to that is to integrate feminist pedagogy, also popular education approaches to teaching data science. And once we start doing that, the way that we teach, what we teach looks very different. And so that looks more like learner-guided exploration, creative visualizations over, the visual neutral minimalism that I was talking about, teaching technology grounded in real issues in communities, using data sets that people know something about and have a cultural connection to, and so on. And so I have a whole strand of my own work that's about data literacy, specifically for newcomers. And these are photos of some of the trainings and workshops that we do with everyone from youth on to, we've done a lot of trainings with like nonprofits and adult learners in mission-driven organizations and community-based organizations specifically. So trying to think about like, how do we connect data science to the work that people are already doing, and think about how that, making it culturally relevant can build those connections, and it can also, introduce, like, basically, or I guess I would just say it bluntly, sort of how can we have data science stop pushing out the women and people of color from the field? Basically, we always talk about missing women in STEM fields, but really it's that we're pushing out the women and the people of color. So this brings me to the final point I'll make before we open up to Q&A. And this may be very obvious from the examples that I've shown, but in data feminism, we really insist on an expanded definition of data science and data visualization. And so our data science is not defined by the size of the data set. It's not defined by the credentials of the people that are undertaking the work. These kinds of concerns are continually used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than purely technical. But if we expand our definition And if what we're interested in is this intersection of data science and justice, then we can see really clearly that some of the most exciting work in data science today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, community organizers, movements and activists, librarians, and so on. And some of the work does look like traditional data science. And so here, like, shout out to Margaret Mitchell and her team at Google. Actually, she was fired. She was the co-lead of the team that Dr. Timnit Gebru was on. She was also fired along with Timnit a little bit later. But incredible work on research on bias in natural language processing. It looks very like data science. And indeed, it's a sort of academic data science, but deeply important work. But then at the same time, right next to that work is this interactive AI-driven sculpture by the artist Stephanie Dinkins. And this is a sculpture that Stephanie trained on a very small data set, which was this intergenerational dialogue in her family of Black women. So she trained this bot to sort of respond to you, but it was only trained on the corpus of text from her own family. So you can walk up to it and talk to it, and it answers you as a sort of a artificial intelligence from Stephanie's family, basically. And then on the right is the Puddings Data Journalism, which examines gender bias in Hollywood screenplays. They do a lot of work that kind of gathers a lot of attention. It's really interesting and creative work looking at bias in the world using data. And then finally, it can also look like murals. So this is the mural at the bottom is by Data Therapy. And this is work that they do with community-based organizations to do data literacy trainings, and then the community together, from learning about their own data, works to make a mural that represents their organization to the community. So we have hundreds of examples like this in the book, which we selected to illustrate our points and inspire readers to action. Because for us, we try to point out, along with so many others, that data is at the root of many of our problems today, and yet at the same time, it can also be part of the solution. So one last thing to mention is we were asked to put data feminism into a couple art exhibitions, and we didn't know how to exhibit the book. So we worked with a designer named Marcia Diaz, and we have these data feminism principles infographics that went into these shows, and we have them available online for download if folks are interested. And they're available in a number of different languages if you're interested in those. Again, just from our book website. And that's it. That's what I've got. These are the many ways that you can be in touch with both Lauren and I. And thank you so much for attending and spending your precious Zoom time with me. I know people are exhausted of Zoom, so I really appreciate that. Yeah, happy to answer questions and comments.
Thank you, Catherine, for your keynote. And my name is Ara Wu, and I'm the Data Science Analysis Research Librarian at Hamilton College, and I'll be moderating today's Q&A session. So we have about 10 minutes, but we can keep continuing this conversation during our meet and greet. So no worries about the time. So please feel free to post any questions into the chat window or raise hands by clicking the reactions button on the Zoom bar menu, and I will call on you so you can ask your questions. Oh, and thank you, Heather, for your great comments in the chat window, saying so inspired to apply data feminism to assessment in higher education, especially around narratives related to binaries implicit in student success.
Fantastic. Cool. That's great.
Yeah. So in the meantime, maybe I can start off with a question I had for you. So
Sure.
Your talk and book had great implications in my understanding, especially for liberal arts institutions, because your book and talk also emphasize the importance of critical thinking skills about implicit biases and underlying power structure. And how can we incorporate these components more to our practices in higher education, perhaps based on your experience? Or also, I saw that you worked across disciplines to develop these projects. So I would also love to hear more about that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, it is a little bit of like an extended case for why does thinking from the humanities and social sciences deeply matter for technical fields right now, you know? And, you know, I think we're seeing our focus is on feminism, but the same could be said for other bodies of knowledge that come out of humanities and social sciences. Because one of the, you know, and again, it's partially, like I said, out of Lauren and I's frustration that it's sort of like the popular press and also technical communities are like, whoa, we're blowing our minds that these algorithms are biased. You know what I mean? And like, oh, there's actually like so much work on this, y'all. We just have to talk to each other. And so for me, the maybe way to like think about this in the university context would be, and I know there's like there's been forever lots of dialogue around interdisciplinary, but I think it really does mean how do we take that really seriously and also put disciplines on very equal footing. Because, you know, what's happening with a lot of institutions is a lot of the money flows and the resources flow to more sort of STEM-oriented fields and so on, and fewer resources to the humanities and social sciences, which just has the unfortunate consequence of then sort of like marginalizing that knowledge even within the like institutional structure as well. So thinking about like how do we integrate these things, how do we put folks in dialogue with each other, and I think, I mean, I have both a technical and a sort of humanities background, but I would say like I think the technical fields also need to have some more humility about the boundaries of what they do and don't cover, because in many cases like technical fields just literally, like especially if they're like if computer science, for example, is looking to solve problems of bias and discrimination in algorithms, they literally cannot do that with the concepts that they currently have right now, because they're not mathematical ways out of this problem. Like the way to do this is to navigate the social and political complexity rather than to exclude it and say that it's not part of the job, right? And so I think that's, you know, that's for me where I see the most exciting work happening, is where folks are really coming together, but like on equal footing, where, you know, one group is not dominant over the other, and then putting these things into play. And then also in curriculum and pedagogy, so like teaching students that way. And that's something that we as educators have lots of control over, at least in our classrooms, is like, how do we teach these technical skills in an integrated way, and or integrate technical skills into some of the liberal arts curricula and projects, and show how they're relevant to, you know, historical studies or to social sciences and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have a question from Tristan. I'll read it. Are there any networks, job boards for finding designers, parentheses, perhaps from marginalized communities, who work on data visualization that incorporates some of these ideas?
Totally. Yeah, the place I'll point you is Design Justice Network. So you can actually join the Design Justice Network, and as a member, either as an individual or your organization can join it. And there's a Slack there, which has like hundreds of people at this point. If some, like I'm a member, for example, and if you wanted to ever ask me to post a job there, I'm happy to do so for you. But that's the main place where I would point folks, because those are folks who are, yeah, really deeply concerned with all of these issues, and sort of how do we create a more just world with design. And then it does include a lot of folks from marginalized backgrounds themselves.
We have another question from Kristen. So you made a comment about considering what to do with data and not harming different groups by drawing attention to them through the sharing of data. Can you explain that idea more?
Sure. Yeah, this one is important. Because like sort of on the one hand, yeah, so on the one hand, you know, what I was talking about with missing data is that groups are underrepresented. So like, for example, until, I don't know, very recently, like 10 years ago, it wasn't mandated by the NIH, the National Institute of Health in the United States, to include equal subjects of different genders. So for a very long time, women were excluded from many health studies. And it was primarily because they menstruate, and scientific researchers felt that was too big of a variable that would affect their research, which is sort of shocking. So this is a case where there's this sort of underrepresentation. But we try to make the point that, you know, in the case of the NIH, they actually have mandated this now. So like, at least there's a policy now that's been addressing that groups need to include, at least in the binary, equal numbers of genders. However, there are issues with sort of overrepresentation in data sets as well. And so you can think about this in the form of surveillance. So for example, like if we think about let's say the US government said, hey, undocumented people, come forward and we're going to put you all in a database and, you know, give you resources or something like that. Most likely people would not come forward, because what is the government going to do, or what might they do with a database of undocumented people, right? It poses a great harm for undocumented people, that they could be targeted, that they could be, you know, picked up, deported, and so on and so forth. And so there are many ways in which, you know, when we count or collect something, especially in relationship to people, that's why we always have to think about, like, which data are we collecting? Are they personally identifiable? Who will know what about whom? And how might they mobilize that information? And you also have to think about this in a durational sense too, because like, I mean, this sort of goes to like the DACA program, let's say under Obama, you know, so like that is actually a case where the government said, hey, come register, young undocumented people, please come register with us. And then there was huge amounts of fear, because then now the US government, say under a new administration, has a way to target, find, potentially do whatever, imprison potentially this list of people that it now has under its purview. So these are the issues that you want to think really really carefully about. And it's why just collecting data just on its own, it can't be considered just a kind of pure social good or something, because the context, the who, always matters. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do you have any other questions from the floor?
I have a question.
Yep, please go ahead.
The issue of communicating with different groups has been I run the social sciences quantitative laboratory at Swarthmore College, and figuring out how to communicate with the humanities folks and the social science folks and the computer science and stats is always, I really want you to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges with that and some of the ways that you've succeeded. And I think that one of the things that I've encountered is that both sides, those folks who are more interested in justice and those folks who are more interested in just crunching the data, kind of feel overwhelmed by the other perspective. Except that the people who are just focused on crunching the numbers are so used to being told that they're the ones who know everything, that they don't quite know how to even frame the discussion. Yeah. So yeah, if you could just talk more about that jargon difference.
Sure. Yeah, I think it is not easy. And I'm actually involved in a project right now, which is really early stages, where like I and a student of mine are in collaboration with these very quantitative sort of computer science folks coming from that tradition. And it's been super respectful and interesting, but then it's been very confusing for all of us, actually, I think, because we're sort of like, what it has meant is just, I guess I would say, like, you need more time. Like, it's not like it's like when you collaborate with somebody who you're like very aligned, either disciplinarily, methodologically, or something like this, you have a set of shared, just even vocabulary and concepts that you draw on. And so you can get collaborations off the ground really quickly. This is a project where we've been in discussion for months, and I think we all feel like we're bringing things to the table, and we're learning from each other and trying to figure out kind of where to go with it. So I think for me, if you think about how do we create those kinds of like low stakes exploratory spaces where there's enough incentive to participate that people will come and do it, you know, and it's interesting enough, but it's not so high stakes that it's, you know, there's like some huge millions of dollars grant on the table or something like that, where then people will be more inclined to like elbow each other out of the way. So thinking about like, how do we create those exploratory spaces for people to meet, exchange knowledge and information, and kind of figure out where there is common ground. And because I think that is work, because it's not always necessarily like logical that to adjust this problem, there would be this like quantitative thing that you would do. But I actually think there are some quantitative things you can do towards justice, right? And so like, it's kind of figuring out where those things can meet and everyone can feel comfortable about it. So I don't have like a very clear answer, just to say that I do think it's hard and it's not straightforward, but I think it's really worthwhile to keep doing whatever you're doing, basically, to keep having these conversations. Yeah.